I rolled up the bay door at 7:15 that Tuesday morning and stopped. There was a silver Mercedes parked inside my workshop. Engine still warm, key fob sitting on my workbench like it had always lived there. She was standing near the drill press with her phone in both hands scrolling. She didn't look up when I walked in, didn't startle, didn't say anything until I'd taken 2 steps into the room and she finally glanced over.
You're the owner?
I said I was. Good. She went back to her phone.
I'm Linda Marsh, HOA president. I have a community walkthrough scheduled right next door, and I needed somewhere to leave the car. Shouldn't be more than an hour, maybe 2.
No question, no request. A statement of fact delivered by a woman standing in the middle of my workspace with her key fob on my bench explaining herself only because I'd appeared, and she had to. I looked past her. Her car had taken the entire center bay. My client's steel 40 pounds of structural bar commissioned job due at 8 was stacked tight behind the rear bumper, completely unreachable. The job was dead before I'd touched a single tool. I need you to move it, I said. She picked up her clipboard from where she'd set it on my work table, and walked toward the side door like someone who had already decided the conversation was over. I'm Linda Marsh, she said again, as if the name was supposed to do something. I've been very lenient with your little operation here. You should be thanking me instead of giving me that look. She pushed the side door open with one hand. Don't touch my car. The door swung shut, her heels on the concrete outside sharp and certain, fading toward the street. Then nothing. I stood in the middle of my own workshop and looked at her car. The workshop sat on a separate parcel I'd owned for over 2 decades, its own deed, its own lot number predating the HOA by 11 years. Not shared space, not a community amenity, mine on paper in full. And she had walked in like none of that existed. My 8 a.m. client texted at 7:52. He was outside. I watched him through the side window, a dark blue truck idling at the curb, waiting on a job he'd driven 40 minutes to get to. I had no good answer to give him. He sat there for 20 minutes before he pulled away without a word. One commission job, gone, because Linda Marsh needed somewhere to park. I walked back to the center of the bay and stood in front of the Mercedes. Up close, it was immaculate silver paint without a mark on it, the kind of car its owner clearly believed was too good to be touched. I thought about the 40 pounds of steel sitting useless behind the rear bumper. I thought about the client driving home in his truck. I thought about the fact that she hadn't asked, hadn't knocked, hadn't hesitated for a single second before making my floor her parking space. Then I looked up into the upper left corner of the room. The security camera I'd mounted there 6 months ago after a cordless drill went missing, and I decided I was done guessing, was blinking its red indicator light in a slow, steady pulse. It started recording at 6 a.m. every morning. Fixed angle wide enough to cover the entire floor, the bench, the press, the center bay, all of it. I checked the time. 7:34. 94 minutes of footage. Already on the drive, time-stamped and clear. It had her walking in, her key fob landing on my bench, her clipboard going down on my work table, me asking her to move, her walking out without doing it, and her last 4 words through the side door. All of it, sitting quietly in the corner, blinking red. 23 years of running a torch teaches you things. You learn to read metal, where it holds, where it gives, where the stress is hiding before it becomes a problem. You learn that things which look solid often aren't, and that things which look fragile are sometimes the hardest things in the room. The most important thing it teaches you is this: the worst thing you can do is mistake a quiet man for a patient one. I took my welding helmet off the hook by the door, checked the gas line, ran my thumb along the striker once the way I always do before I start. I didn't call the HOA office. Didn't knock on Linda Marsh's door, didn't leave a note under the windshield wiper or text anyone or give the situation a single more second of deliberation. I just got to work. She had no idea the camera blinking in that corner had been recording since 6 in the morning and that I hadn't decided yet how long her car was going to stay. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what kind of place this was before Linda Marsh decided she was in charge of it. Sycamore Ridge was a quiet suburb. 96 homes on 6 streets, the kind of neighborhood where people waved from driveways and left zucchini on each other's porches in late summer. Nobody loved the HOA. You don't love an HOA, it's a background condition like traffic noise or property taxes. You notice it when it gets loud, otherwise you forget it's there. Linda Marsh made sure nobody forgot. She moved into 4 Cartwright Lane 4 years before that Tuesday morning, and within 8 months, she'd run for HOA president on a platform she called Community Standards Restoration. The previous board had been 3 retired men who approved things by default and argued about the agenda. Linda beat the incumbent by 11 votes and immediately got to work. Year 134 fines issued to 96 households. Year 261. She had a clipboard system, a category list she'd apparently drafted herself, classifying everything from mailbox lettering color to the acceptable diameter of decorative stones in a flower bed. Notice first. Fine if ignored. Lien threat if the fine sat unpaid. For most people in Sycamore Ridge, that was where the argument ended. The retired couple at number 14, Walt and Evelyn, both in their late 70s, got a $300 fine for a hummingbird feeder. The notice called it a non-approved external structure. Evelyn had put it up the spring after her sister died because her sister had kept one just like it. They paid the fine and took it down. The single mother at number 22 got a letter in February threatening foreclosure proceedings because of a hairline crack in her driveway. Not structural, not a safety issue, a hairline crack that had been there since the last hard winter. She had 30 days to repair or face legal escalation. It cost her $400 she didn't have easy access to. There was a 13-year-old kid on Birchwood with a portable basketball hoop at the end of his driveway. Linda had it photographed, cited, and confiscated inside 2 weeks. The notice said it degraded curbside aesthetics. That was the machine she'd built. I had received 3 fines in 2 years. First grass allegedly over the approved length. I had photographs from the same morning. Compliant. I paid anyway because fighting it would cost more time than the fine was worth. That's how the system worked. The cost of resistance was designed to exceed the cost of submission. Second fine, exterior paint color on my garage trim flagged as non-compliant. I had the color code, the paint receipt, and a written approval from the previous board. I contested it and won, but it took 4 months of back and forth and 2 board meetings for anyone to acknowledge in writing that I was right. 4 months for something that should have taken a phone call. The third fine was still pending. Unauthorized commercial noise from the workshop. When I pulled the county zoning ordinance to fight it, I found exactly what I expected. Residential classification in this district explicitly permits personal trade work on private structures within standard noise thresholds. I was within limits. The fine had no basis. But while I had the bylaws open, I kept reading. Section 12 stopped me. 1 paragraph plain language, HOA authority does not extend to the interior spaces of individually deeded private structures. I read it twice. I wrote the section number on a notepad and set it next to my keyboard. The workshop lot had its own deed, separate parcel number, separate tax record, purchased outright before the HOA's articles of incorporation were ever filed. The HOA's own founding boundary maps didn't include that parcel. Not something I created. A boundary that had always existed in county records sitting in a filing cabinet downtown waiting. Linda had been circling the workshop for 2 years. Something about it bothered her, maybe because a working tradesman on a separate deeded lot didn't fit the aesthetic she was curating, maybe because she'd simply decided it was hers to regulate and hadn't looked closely enough to find out it wasn't. Either way, she'd been pushing. I had been building a file for 14 months. Dates, fine amounts, photos, emails, copies of every notice. Not because I planned anything specific. Because with Linda Marsh, I had learned one thing clearly. Something was always eventually coming. That Tuesday morning it arrived. 2.5 hours passed. Linda Marsh did not come back. I worked what I could, bench jobs, small stuff, anything that didn't require the center bay. I sharpened blades that didn't need sharpening. I reorganized materials I'd organized the week before. At 9:45, I set the tools down, stood in the workshop doorway and looked at her car. Then I took out my phone and documented everything. The Mercedes in the center bay, the blocked floor, the 40 pounds of structural steel sitting exactly where it had been when I arrived. 47 photographs time-stamped, 3 of them with the license plate clear and readable. Before I left, I stepped next door. Dave Kowalski from number 18 was out front trimming the edge of his lawn. He'd been there since early morning. He looked up when I came up the drive. "Saw the whole thing," he said before I could open my mouth. I told him I might need to remember that later. He said he had nowhere else to be. I walked 3 streets over to 4 Cartwright Lane. Karen's front door had a decorative wreath on it, the season-appropriate kind that gets swapped out every 6 weeks, the kind that signals to the neighborhood that the person inside monitors these things carefully. I knocked twice. She answered in under a minute, which told me she'd seen me coming up the walk. She had a glass of water in one hand and an expression that said lunch had been interrupted. "I need the car moved," I said. "We've already had this conversation." "We haven't. You left before it was finished." I kept my voice level. "I lost a commission job this morning. My client drove 40 minutes, waited 20 minutes, and left because he couldn't access the bay. That's real financial damage. The car is parked on separately deeded private property without permission. I'm asking you to move it." That's the conversation. She looked at me for a moment. Then she turned and walked back into the house, leaving the door open. She came back with a manila folder, same format she used for fine notices. "I've been preparing to address your workshop situation for some time," she said. "The operation you're running there constitutes commercial activity in a residential zone which places it under HOA aesthetic and commercial jurisdiction. I'm authorized to begin formal enforcement." She held up a printed sheet. "Notice of violation. $500 per day until you cease commercial operations or bring the property into compliance. County zoning allows personal trade work on private structures in this classification," I said. "I'm within noise thresholds. The fine has no legal basis. Take that up with the board." She started to close the folder. "The car," I said. She stopped. Something shifted in her expression, less like anger, more like someone deciding to stop being polite about what they actually meant. "The car stays until I'm ready to move it. I needed parking and your workshop was available." She said the word available with a slight pause, like she'd selected it carefully. "I've been more than patient with your little operation. If you want to make an issue of this, I'd suggest you think carefully about whether that's in your interest. I'm asking one final time, please move the car." She looked straight at me. "And if you touch it," she said clearly and without hesitation, "I will have you arrested for property damage. We clear." I held her gaze for a moment. Then I said, "Thank you for your time," and turned and walked back down the path. My phone had been recording from my shirt pocket since I knocked on her door. I had her fine threat. I had her arrest threat. I had the exact words, "The car stays until I'm ready. I will have you arrested for property damage," in clean audio time-stamped to 10:14 a.m. 23 years in the trade had taught me that documentation is always cheaper to gather before you need it than after. I'd started recording the moment I stepped onto her porch because I already knew how this kind of conversation ended. I passed Dave Kowalski again on the walk back. He'd moved to the side of his yard closest to the street, still trimming, still watching. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. Some things don't need to be said out loud to be understood. Back in the bay, I stood in front of the Mercedes and took stock of what I had. 47 time-stamped photographs. 4+ hours of camera footage on the drive, still running, still blinking in the corner. An audio file with a $500 a day fine threat and an explicit arrest threat, both recorded at 10:14 a.m. on Karen's own front porch. A Section 12 notation sitting on a notepad at my desk. A parcel deed and HOA boundary maps that agreed on exactly one thing: this property had never been theirs to regulate. And a neighbor at number 18 who had watched the entire morning unfold and volunteered without being asked that he'd seen everything. That was what I was looking at. Not a complaint, not a grievance. A stack of evidence that had been building itself all morning without me having to do much of anything. I thought about Evelyn's hummingbird feeder. I thought about the 13-year-old kid on Birchwood and his basketball hoop photographed and confiscated in 2 weeks flat. I thought about Linda Marsh standing in my workshop that morning. My workshop on my land on a parcel she had no authority over, telling me I should be thanking her. I picked up my welding helmet and dropped the visor. I didn't call my attorney that night. I didn't call the police. I sealed every door panel from the outside, set the helmet down on the workbench, picked up my keys, and drove away without looking back. I found out later what happened that morning. Not from Karen. From a roadside assistance dispatch record and 2 officers' written report, both of which I eventually held in my hands. Karen came back to the workshop at 9 a.m. on day 1. She pressed the key fob from the sidewalk. Nothing. Pressed it again from inside the bay doorway. Still nothing. She walked to the driver's door, tried the handle. Wouldn't move. She reached for her physical key, the metal one you rarely use anymore, and found no keyhole on the door panel to put it in. She circled the car, then circled it again. Then she called Mercedes roadside assistance. The technician arrived inside the hour. He crouched at the driver's door seam, ran 2 fingers along the edge, stood back up and looked at her. "Ma'am," he said, "this was done deliberately. We can't touch this. You'll need a specialist." Karen called 911. 2 officers arrived. Standard questions, standard process. "Is this your vehicle?" "Yes." "Do you have authorization to park it on this property?" Pause. They wrote down the pause. They wrote down what they found: vehicle located inside a private workshop structure on a separately deeded parcel. No signs of forced entry to the workshop, meaning whoever had worked on the car had been on the property with legitimate access. The vehicle's presence on the property predated any contact with the property owner. Officers advised removing the vehicle would require engaging the property owner directly. Then they handed her a report number and drove away. Karen was standing in my workshop next to a welded Mercedes, holding a police report that described in official language exactly what she had done. She'd parked on someone else's private property without authorization. The responding officers had documented it in writing. Her own 911 call had generated the paperwork. She had filed the first record in her own case against herself, and she'd done it without any help from me whatsoever. I was 2 states away. A friend of mine, Gary, someone I'd worked alongside in my early 20s and hadn't seen properly in a couple of years, had called me the week before about some old equipment he was trying to identify. I'd been meaning to drive out for months, 3 days, give or take. I left Tuesday evening after I set the helmet down on the workbench and locked the bay, and by Wednesday morning I was sitting on Gary's back porch with a cup of coffee, watching his 2 dogs run slow, satisfied loops around the yard. I was not hiding. I had no reason to hide. The workshop was my property. The car was on my property. What I had done on my own land, and I had already confirmed with the only person whose professional opinion mattered that the law on that point was not complicated. On Tuesday evening, pulled over at a rest stop somewhere in the middle of the drive. I'd sent 2 things to my attorney, Martin Reeves, the complete camera footage, 6 hours from 6 a.m. uncut, and a scanned copy of the parcel deed with the HOA founding boundary map attached. Martin called back in 40 minutes. "I've watched the first 30 minutes of the footage," he said. I asked him what he thought. "I'm going to watch the rest before I say anything official." A brief pause. "Where did you find this client?" I told him she'd found me. He called again 3 hours later. Second thing he said, "Don't come home yet." I told him I wasn't planning to until Friday. "Good. Let it sit. She's going to keep moving, and every move she makes is going to be useful to you." I didn't ask him to elaborate. Martin had been practicing property and civil law for 26 years. When he said, "Let it sit," I let it sit. Wednesday evening, I checked my phone for the first time since the drive. 11 missed calls. I didn't return any of them. I listened to the voicemails. Third one in was Dave Kowalski from number 18. His voice was quiet, like he was somewhere he didn't want to be overheard. "Hey, I don't know exactly what's going on over there, but I saw everything Tuesday morning. I saw her drive in. I saw you come out and ask her to move. I saw her leave without doing it. I want you to know if you need a witness, you've got one. Several of us do, actually." A short pause. "Just thought you should know." I set the phone face down on Gary's kitchen counter and went back outside. By day 2, the specialist Karen had been referred to couldn't get out until the following week. The workshop stayed closed. The Mercedes stayed where it was. The voicemails coming into my phone got longer, more formal, and then noticeably quieter in a way that told me someone had gotten legal advice about what not to say out loud. Whatever Karen was planning for day 2, she was planning it with help now. Martin had told me to let her move. She was moving. The best part about disappearing is that the other person has to stay and deal with the mess they made. Karen had 3 full days to keep generating her own record. A 911 call that produced a trespass documentation. A specialist she couldn't get scheduled. A car she couldn't move without the property owner's cooperation, and the property owner was unreachable. Every hour there was another hour she spent solving a problem she had created entirely by herself. She had all 3 days to keep building her case against herself, and she did not disappoint. Martin called Thursday morning at 7:42. I was on Gary's back porch again, same coffee, same 2 dogs. He didn't say good morning. She retained counsel Wednesday morning, he said. By noon, she had a formal vandalism complaint filed with the county police. I set the mug down. Criminal mischief, deliberate property damage. If it proceeds, you're looking at potential criminal charges and civil liability for the full cost of repairs to the vehicle. He paused. We're talking about a Mercedes. That number won't be small. This was the moment, if there was one, where I was supposed to feel the ground shift under me. A criminal complaint. My name on a police record. The kind of thing that follows a person in ways that have nothing to do with whether they were right or wrong. I picked the mug back up. Tell me the flaw, I said. To prove vandalism, Martin said, she has to establish that the vehicle had legal authorization to be on the property when the damage occurred. To establish authorization, she has to prove she had permission to park there. He let that sit for a second. Her own complaint documents that the car was inside your workshop. Her own 911 call from day 1 documents the same location. She has now filed 2 separate official records that place her vehicle on your private property, and your camera shows she never once asked permission to put it there. I thought about that. She filed a vandalism complaint that required admitting exactly where her car was and how it got there, I said. That's the rope, Martin said. She built it herself. The vandalism complaint was the headline, but it wasn't the only thing waiting for me at home. Martin told me about the second move. The HOA had issued an emergency enforcement notice, certified mail sent to my home address while I was away. $5,000. Fine for unauthorized commercial activity, same charge they'd been circling for months. Plus a formal notice of intent. If the fine was unpaid within 30 days, they would file a lien against my property. A lien meant the debt attached to the deed of my home. It didn't require a court order to initiate, it just appeared in the public record sitting against your title, making it impossible to sell or refinance until it was resolved. Linda had used this before. The single mother at number 22 had gotten a lien threat in February over a hairline crack in her driveway. She paid. They all paid because most people can't afford to find out what happens if they don't. 30 days, that was the clock she'd set. There's a third thing, Martin said, and I could hear something in his voice that wasn't quite amusement, but was somewhere in its neighborhood. Karen had posted on the neighborhood app. I didn't have the app on my phone, never had, but Martin had been forwarded a screenshot by someone in Sycamore Ridge who had his number. The post read, more or less, the owner of the workshop property had vandalized and trapped her vehicle, was refusing to cooperate with authorities, and represented her exact phrase, a dangerous element in our community. She'd named the address. She'd used the word dangerous twice. The post spread through the neighborhood within the hour. Some neighbors responded with alarm. A few people who didn't know me well left comments asking what was happening on the street. But Martin said something else was also happening in the background. Several residents, people who had been fined by Karen in recent years, who had paid without fighting and moved on, and said nothing, had started sending private messages to my phone. My phone, which was still face down on Gary's kitchen counter. They weren't angry messages, Martin said. They were careful ones, the kind of messages people write when they've been quiet for a long time and have finally decided to stop. I thought about the lien threat, $5,000, 30 days. I also thought about Section 12. One paragraph in the HOA's own founding documents authority does not extend to individually deeded private structures. I set the coffee mug down again slowly this time. The $5,000 fine, the lien, the commercial activity charge, every piece of it rested on the assumption that Karen had jurisdiction over my workshop. She didn't. Her own founding documents said so. But that hadn't been tested in public yet, and until it was, the notice was real and the clock was running. That's the thing about a well-built lien threat. It doesn't have to be legally sound to create real pressure. It just has to arrive in a certified envelope and give you 30 days to decide whether you can afford to fight it. Linda Marsh had broken a dozen people in Sycamore Ridge with exactly this move, and she knew it worked because none of them had ever come back at her with the documents she hadn't bothered to read. On paper, Linda Marsh was winning. A criminal complaint on file, a $5,000 fine with a lien attached, a neighborhood app post calling me dangerous, and the property owner, me, still 2 states away, unreachable, having said nothing publicly in 3 days. I was still on Gary's porch. I had about 12 hours left before I needed to start driving. Martin called again that night at 9 p.m. "Look at her complaint one more time," he said. "Really look at it. She admitted where the car was. She admitted it was in your workshop. She put it in writing under her name and filed it with the county. That document is now part of the public record." A pause. "Every move she's made in 3 days has been documented by her." I told him I understood. "She's been doing your work for you," he said. "All you need to do is show up with what you already have." On the morning of day 3, Martin called at 6 a.m. 2 sentences. "She made a critical mistake with that complaint. Come home." I told him I'd be back by evening. I wasn't at the meeting. I was still driving home when it happened, somewhere on a dark interstate with the radio off. I heard about it afterward from 3 different people who were there, and the accounts lined up well enough that I'm confident in the shape of what happened. Karen called an emergency HOA board meeting for Wednesday evening, day 2. 15 neighbors showed up. Not all of them came for any particular reason. Some just saw the emergency notice pushed to the neighborhood app and were curious. Walt and Evelyn from number 14 were there. Dave Kowalski from number 18. A handful of others who had been on the receiving end of Karen's clipboard over the years. And several who hadn't been, who came in genuinely concerned about what the post had said about a dangerous element on the street. Karen presented it as a criminal matter. She stood at the head of the table with her binder and her posture and ran through the situation like she was reading a verdict. A workshop owner in the neighborhood had deliberately vandalized her vehicle, had refused to engage with authorities, had disappeared rather than face consequences, and was currently sitting on an unresolved fine for unauthorized commercial activity. She was precise and she was polished, and she sounded like someone who had done this before, which she had just usually in smaller rooms with fewer people watching. Her attorney joined by speakerphone. The voice through the phone was calm and professional and methodical in the way that lawyer voices always are when the rest of the room isn't made of lawyers. He laid out the picture in order: criminal vandalism complaint filed with county police. HOA fine of $5,000 with a 30-day lien notice already initiated. Board authority to escalate daily fines if compliance was not achieved. and if the property owner failed to respond within the enforcement window, the HOA had legal standing to seek court-ordered access to the property. Court-ordered access. 3 of the 5 board members were nodding. 2 sat very still and said nothing. In the room with a speakerphone running and certified notices on the table and the phrase court-ordered hanging in the air, the situation sounded like what Karen needed it to sound like: settled. Overwhelming. The kind of thing where the only reasonable response was to write a check because the alternative was a process most people in that room couldn't afford to navigate and didn't know how to fight. This was exactly how she had always won. For about 10 minutes, the meeting belonged entirely to her. A few neighbors exchanged glances across the table, but no one spoke. The legal language sat in the room like furniture, heavy, unfamiliar, occupying all the available space. Phil Garrett, the board chair, took notes without looking up. The speakerphone attorney filled every silence with another clause, another threshold, another piece of procedural architecture that made the whole thing feel immovable. Nobody knew quite where to grab hold of it and pull. Then Dave Kowalski stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't address the room. He looked at Karen directly and said in a tone that was close to conversational, "I need to say something for the record since we're apparently on the record." Karen started to cut him off. Phil Garrett held up one hand in her direction without looking at her and nodded at Dave to continue. Dave said he had been in his front yard the morning of the incident. He had seen Karen's Mercedes pull into the workshop, driven in, parked by Karen herself. He had watched the narrator come out and ask her to move. He had watched her refuse. He had heard her leave without moving the car. He was willing to provide a written statement to that effect, dated and signed to anyone in the room who wanted one. The speakerphone was quiet. Karen said his information was irrelevant to the enforcement matter at hand. Phil told her she'd had her turn. Then Walt stood up from number 14 slowly, the way a man in his late 70s stands up when he's decided something is worth standing up for. He had a printed sheet of paper that he'd folded into thirds and then opened back out, the crease lines still sharp across the middle. He held it with both hands because they weren't quite steady enough to hold it flat with one. He read from it without preamble. One paragraph. HOA. Founding Bylaws, Section 12. Authority does not extend to the interior spaces of individually deeded private structures. He lowered the paper and looked at Karen over the top of his reading glasses. "Is the workshop," he said, "on a separate parcel deed?" Karen's attorney on the speakerphone said nothing. Karen said the bylaws were being taken out of context and that the board would need to assess the full framework of relevant provisions before drawing any conclusions from a single paragraph. Walt folded the paper back along its creases and put it in his shirt pocket. He sat back down. He didn't say anything else. The question was already in the room and it wasn't moving. Phil Garrett set his pen down on the table in front of him. The small sound of it was the loudest thing in the room for a moment. "Linda," he said, quieter now, more deliberate, the way someone speaks when they already know the answer they're about to not receive. "Did you have written permission from the property owner to park in his workshop?" The speakerphone static filled the silence. Karen said she had acted within her capacity as HOA president and that the board should refocus on the outstanding violations and the enforcement timeline rather than, "Did you have permission?" Phil said again. Same tone, same pace. "He told me about it when I got back to town, said he'd been running HOA meetings in Sycamore Ridge for 11 years. In 11 years, he said that was the first time he had ever seen Linda Marsh have absolutely nothing to say. I got back to Sycamore Ridge at 6:47 p.m. on day 3. I didn't go home. I drove past my street, kept going 2 miles to the county building parked in the visitor lot, and walked through the front door of the police station with a manila folder under one arm and a USB drive in my shirt pocket. I asked the desk officer for the detective assigned to a vandalism complaint filed by Linda Marsh within the last 48 hours. He made a call. I waited 11 minutes in a chair near the door. Detective Ray Callahan came out from a side hallway, mid-50s, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. The kind of unhurried that comes from 2 decades of seeing events in the order they actually happened rather than the order people claimed they did. He looked at the folder. "Workshop on Millbrook," he said. I said yes. He took me back to a small conference room. No speakerphone, no binder, just a table, 2 chairs, a laptop on the corner, and the specific quality of silence that exists in rooms where things get sorted out properly. I set the folder down and placed the USB drive on top of it. "I'm the owner of the property," I said. "I'd like to show you something before this goes any further." He plugged the drive in without ceremony. The footage opened at 6 a.m., timestamp in the lower left corner, white digits on black. Empty workshop, clean floor equipment organized along the walls. Callahan leaned back in his chair and watched. I didn't say a word. I sat across from him and waited. At the 1:13:07 mark, the bay door rolled up from outside. The camera angle was wide, full floor coverage. A silver Mercedes pulled into the center bay and stopped. The driver's door opened. A woman got out carrying a clipboard and a phone, walked to the bench on the right side of the room, set her key fob down on the surface and began scrolling. Callahan leaned forward slightly. At 1:15:22, I walked in through the front. He watched me stop, watched me take in the car, the blocked floor, the woman at my bench, watched me say something to her, watched her glance up, briefly speak, and go back to her phone. At 1:17:44, she picked up her clipboard from my work table and walked to the side door. At 1:17:59, she was gone. The Mercedes was still there. I was still there, standing in the center of the floor, looking at it. Callahan's jaw shifted slightly. He kept watching. The timestamp ran forward. I left at 1:42:06. A dark blue truck appeared briefly at the curb and pulled away at 1:43:18. Then the workshop was empty, car in the center bay, nobody else, hour after hour, timestamp counting steadily upward. At 3:08:41, Karen came back. She pressed the fob, tried the handle, circled the car. He watched the roadside technician, watched the two officers arrive, take notes, leave, watched Karen standing next to the welded Mercedes with a report number in her hand while the patrol car pulled away. He paused the footage. He took the reading glasses off his forehead and put them on. Then he looked at me. I opened the folder and laid two things on the table. First, the parcel deed, separate lot number from my residence, dated 23 years back, my name on the signature line. Second, the HOA's own founding boundary map, the one that showed in their own recorded documents that the workshop parcel sat outside the lines they'd filed with the county. Callahan picked up both. Then he looked at the file folder already open on the table in front of him, his file on Karen's complaint. He found a page and read something near the top. The Day 1 police report, generated by Karen's own 911 call. It placed the vehicle at my workshop address on a separately deeded parcel with the owner absent and no authorization on record. He set it down slowly. She called 911, he said, not a question. Day 1 reported the car's location herself. He nodded once. I took my phone out and set it on the table. I played 30 seconds of audio, her voice clear through the small speaker, and if you touch it, I will have you arrested for property damage. We clear. We. He listened to it once, asked me to play it again. The second time he held his pen in his hand without writing, just held it, eyes on the middle of the table. He set the pen down. She told you not to touch it, he said. On my property, I said, after she parked there without asking. A long pause. He wrote something in the file, turned a page, wrote something else. Then he looked up. This is going to go a different direction than she anticipated. He closed his folder and spoke plainly. The vandalism complaint was not going to proceed. Proving vandalism required establishing that the vehicle was lawfully on the property, and between the footage, the deed, the boundary map, the report Karen had generated herself, and the audio, there was no version of that argument that held. He paused there, let it settle. What the evidence showed, he continued, was an unauthorized vehicle on private property and an owner acting on his own land. He would note that a trespass inquiry on the other side of the matter might be appropriate. He thanked me for coming in. I walked back out through the front door into the parking lot. The sun was almost gone. The workshop was dark when I pulled up. Bay doors closed, same as I'd left them 3 days ago. I unlocked the side door and went in. The Mercedes was exactly where it was. The camera in the upper left corner blinked red, still recording. I stood in front of the car and thought about Karen coming back that first morning, pressing the fob from the sidewalk, circling the car, calling a technician who told her he couldn't touch it. I thought about, "Don't touch my car," said on her way out the side door, certain and final, the last thing she said in this room before everything she thought she controlled started to give way. I went to the tool cabinet and took out the cutting wheel. The evidence was already in a detective's file. The deed was on record. The audio was saved in 3 places. The camera had done the one thing I'd needed it to do. The doors were just doors now. I worked quietly without hurry. The seams opened cleanly. When I finished, I set the cutting wheel on the bench and stepped back. She had no idea when she walked in here 3 days ago and told me not to touch her car that she had handed me the only case I would ever need. The camera in the corner had seen all of it from the beginning. It had not forgotten a single frame. The fallout happened in stages the way it usually does when paperwork finally moves in the right direction. Martin called 3 days after my visit to the station. The vandalism complaint against me had been closed, insufficient evidence to proceed. Callahan's notation referenced the camera footage and the complete absence of authorization documentation for the vehicle. Karen's attorney had already submitted a withdrawal letter, quietly without explanation. A separate entry noted that a trespass inquiry on the other side of the matter remained open. No hearing, no courtroom, just a closed file and a lawyer who had watched the footage and done the math. The HOA's $5,000 fine came down next. Martin sent the parcel deed and the HOA's own founding boundary maps to their retained legal counsel, different from the one on Karen's speakerphone. That counsel issued a written memo to the board within a week. The workshop parcel fell outside their enforcement jurisdiction, as drawn in their own founding documents. The fine and the lien notice were formally withdrawn. In writing, all 3 of my outstanding fines, including the 2 I'd paid without fighting, were entered into the record as improperly issued. Karen arranged for a specialist shop to come out and open the Mercedes. 2 days of work, she paid out of pocket. The footage and the deed made any civil claim against me untenable, and her attorney had reached that conclusion quickly enough to avoid making it in public. The financial damage from that week was entirely hers. The social piece moved more decisively than I expected. 10 days after my visit to the station, Linda Marsh submitted her resignation as HOA president ahead of a recall petition that had been circulating through Sycamore Ridge for most of the previous week. I don't know exactly how many signatures it had. I know it had enough that she could read which way things were going without needing to be told. Dave Kowalski from number 18, Walt and Evelyn from number 14, and 4 others formed a bylaw reform committee the same week. They'd been talking for longer than just these 3 days, the kind of conversations that happen in driveways and over back fences when people have been carrying something for a long time and finally have a reason to put it down. A new board was elected 6 weeks later. First formal vote expunge all fines previously issued to my address and enter a written acknowledgement into the HOA's official record that the workshop parcel was outside their jurisdiction. Unanimous. Second vote, no fine issued going forward without written photographic evidence reviewed by the full board before the notice went out. Walt told me about both votes at the fence one evening about a week after the election. He said it the way he said most things, plainly without emphasis, like he was reading off a list. They voted on the hummingbird feeder too, he said. I asked him what they'd decided. That it was never a violation in the first place. He paused. Evelyn put it back up. I thought about that for a while after he walked back inside. The week after everything settled, I booked 3 weeks of commissioned work back to back. First client in the Bay was a structural fabrication job, bar stock, straightforward, the kind of work I can pace without thinking. He pulled up at 7:50 a.m. and had full access by 7:51. We finished before early afternoon. He left satisfied. I cleaned the floor and started setting up for the next one. I replaced the security camera at the end of that month. Newer model, wider angle, better low light resolution. I didn't need to. The old one still ran fine, and the footage from that Tuesday morning was backed up in 4 separate places. But a workshop that had been through what this one had been through deserved better eyes. The evening I installed it, I stood in the center of the bay for a while. The doors were open. The last of the daylight came in long across the floor, equipment clean and organized along the walls, no silver Mercedes in the center bay, no key fob on the bench, no clipboard, no fine notice taped to the wall, no woman at my work table telling me I should be thanking her. Just the smell of metal and the day's work already behind me and tomorrow's already waiting. I never got an apology from Linda Marsh. But the morning I pulled the first new job through those doors with the whole bay to myself and no one in the world who had any business being there except me and the work I didn't need one.